So my talk today is basically, can we start talking about something else besides hypertrophy? But this is very much an open discussion because that's just the way how I like to present. But I asked one of my students before I did this presentation, I said, go on Google Scholar and just do a quick search for the last 2 years on papers that have been published on hypertrophy versus power or velocity. And unfortunately, my hypothesis didn't work because there have been a lot more papers published on power, but it's not really what I can call good research. And why velocity? We're going to kind of talk about that. But this is really kind of my journey from A&M and what I've published since then in regards to velocity. So we just actually got approval to open the Sports Science Center. So I'm now director of the Sports Science Center at Texas Christian University, which is exciting. It includes my lab, which is the Exercise and Sports Performance Laboratory, and our other lab group, which is the Sports Concussion Research Group. To the right, you see some of my kids that have been with me for a while, but I just have to hit a shout out to all the people who are with me right now, which is Anthony, Andy, Daniel, Alexa, Jason, Will, Gavin, and Taylor. Those are who I have right now. And the next statement is disclosure. Over this last year, I've been presenting a lot with concussions. This is the first time I've presented on resistance training, so I may be a little rusty. But last week, I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, giving presentations to a bunch of neurologists who were studying CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And they're all neurologists, all old men, and so my statement to them was, I am not a neurologist, but I can squat more than anybody in the room. So I just wanted them to know that. I may not have been as smart as them, but I was stronger than them if they had a problem. So I kept that up there for today. So I'm calling this a former student's journey, and I'm going back to my dissertation a few years back. So I'm going to give you a little background. And I'm really interested in resistance training, specifically the resistance training variables, because I like to lift weights. So what are our resistance training variables? You've got intensity, repetitions, repetition speed, rest period, and volume. This is our kind of NSCA. Everybody knows this. This is the template for how we prescribe resistance training. I don't like this template. I think it's very bad, but it's the template nonetheless. It's kind of like this is a recipe you get off Food Network and you have to go in and alter it a little bit. So here's some examples of traditional resistance training. So this was kind of my idea, is how do we go in and we mess with traditional resistance training paradigms and get a different outcome? So traditional resistance set configurations involve performance of repetitions over a period of time continuously, then you take a rest, and then you come back and you perform the next set. I didn't like that. I mean, why didn't I like that? Because the research says that the more repetitions you perform, your force decreases. The more repetitions you perform, your velocity decreases. And so what's that mean? That the more repetitions you perform, power decreases. Well, tell me any sport. If you can name any sport that doesn't require power, I will give you $5 right now. I'd have to go to the ATM, but I would give you $5 right now. There's not a sport, even marathon running, requires some type of power output. So we know the causes of fatigue, and I'm not going to go into that because I don't want to sit here and belabor you with exercise physiology, because I know you've had plenty of it. But it all goes down to what's resulting in the fatigue that's causing us to slow down. And this is just more exercise physiology about the time course of phosphocreatine resynthesis, which is fairly rapid. So my thought in terms of periodization is we spend, and this is your traditional periodization where you spend time in hypertrophy, strength, and power, and then you peak, that whole hypertrophy section should basically be gone away with. Completely. Always. Should never exist. And why do I think that? Well, this is why. Would you have a 100-meter sprinter ever run a mile? Would you have a football player ever run a mile? Would you ever, punishment. A volleyball player ever run a mile? So why are we making them, quote unquote, run a mile with resistance training? I get in an argument, I was just telling Matthew that my current student right now is a former power lifter and is transferring over to be an Olympic weightlifter. And he does my programming now because I don't have time. And he wrote in a bunch of volume, and I said, don't give me this. I said, this is bad programming. He said, no, you need volume. And so we hash it out. And so I'm interested to hear your comments as we move through. So this is my dissertation. This was the paper that was my dissertation. So I kind of did things backwards. You know, most people do an acute study, then they do a training study. I did a full training study and then went back and said, okay, now why did this happen? So this was my dissertation. So what I did is I took Marines. They were all Marines. And here's just their statistics, demographics. And I put them through a 12-week training program designed to elicit hypertrophy. So I was comparing two different resistance training paradigms. 12 weeks, periodized appropriately. We were looking at body composition, we were looking at strength, and we were looking at power, because that's what I was interested in. My hypothesis was really simple. This is just kind of showing the interclass correlations for some of the tests. Where do I get to it? Oops, maybe I don't. What we looked at was cluster sets. I don't like to use that term cluster sets, but does anybody know what a cluster set is? What's a cluster set?
It's like you'll perform maybe 3 reps, take a brief pause, maybe another 1 rep, brief pause, and now that counted as 4.
Yes and no. That's kind of considered rest pause. So people get confused over what's cluster set and what's rest pause. Cluster sets involve, if I take 10 repetitions, if I'm supposed to do 10 repetitions, I'm going to take a brief rest somewhere in the middle. I'm going to unrack it, take that brief rest, and then I'm going to go back to it. So in this case, what we did is we did 4 sets of 10, because that's typical for hypertrophy. But with one group, instead of 4 sets of 10 with 2 minutes rest, we basically did 8 sets of 5 with 1 minute rest. So we broke them up into sets of 5. Same intensity as you would do with the 4 sets of 10, but all in sets of 5. So what we were looking at is to see, because what happens when I showed you earlier is what starts to decrease? Power starts to decrease, potentially force starts to decrease, velocity starts to decrease. So we're trying to attenuate that drop in velocity. This is just the workout. You can see it was a full body, 4 days a week. It was upper body push followed by lower body plus upper body pull, day off, and then they came back again. This is just diet, showing that their diet was good, no issues with that. Protein was where it was supposed to be. Major lifts, total volume load. Total volume load is what? Sets times reps times load. So what we were making sure of is we wanted to make sure that the total volume load was not different between the clusters and the traditional. And in fact, it wasn't. We were kind of scared about that at the beginning because of, I'll talk about when we get to the training, but there was no difference between upper body, lower body, or the assistive lifts. Anything, there was no difference. All right, so it might be hard to see, but these were the power measures. Power measures: bench press to body mass ratio, bench press to lean mass, back squat, all to lean mass ratio, vertical jump, same thing. If you look here to the right, this is what we're calling intraset rest interval. What we see is by week 8, you start seeing a separation. So basically, bench press power, squat power, vertical jump power, all increased by the second cycle, the 8-week block, greater than that of the traditional set. So we're seeing increases, even though they were doing the same amount of total work. This is just a graph that shows the percent change, and you can see the percent change here. What's interesting is right here in the percent change, you actually see a decrease. Why would you see that? The top is the bench press. Then you have back squat, then you have vertical jump. The decrease is because they were becoming fatigued. So the 4 sets of 10 actually fatigued them to the point that we saw a decrease. And then they saw the increase, but look how much greater the increase was here, here, and here in the intraset rest intervals. Bench press just the change in absolute power. And strength measures. Now this is what we weren't expecting to find. So because we inserted that brief rest, we were allowed to maintain velocity over each repetition for the sets of 5 versus the sets of 10. Okay? What we didn't expect to find were greater strength gains. They increased greater in bench press. They increased greater in squat, as you can see over here to the right. That was something we were not sure about or why that actually happened. And then that just shows a percent change. And then body composition. This was another interesting finding we expected, but what you see is there were no differences in lean mass gain. So if I did the same workout with 8 sets of 5 versus 4 sets of 10, I maintained velocity, I get the same gains in lean mass, but I get stronger and I get faster. Okay? It seems like a non-issue, right? This is what should be done. What was underlying that change? We thought it might have something to do with myosin heavy chain, meaning that I had a shift in myosin heavy chain with one greater than I did in the other. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We see changes in both. You see a shift from myosin 2X to 2A, and some shift from the slow up to the 2A as well. So there was no difference in the myosin heavy chain. Effect sizes were all greater in the cluster sets. So before I go into the next one, I want to say that if you kind of follow this literature, what's interesting is a group out of Spain recently published a paper. Their paper was called, it was all about velocity, and what they did was really interesting. They did an 8-week training study. In their 8-week training study, they allowed one group to drop 20%. So each set, they allowed a 20% drop in velocity, from repetition 1 to 20%. The other group, they allowed to drop 40%. 40% drop. So basically, it's similar to this, but they did not account for greater total volume load. So at the end of the 8 weeks, the people who lost velocity of 20% had not done the same total volume load as those who lost 40%. Which one do you think got stronger? No. The 20% got stronger. They also got more powerful. Which one got greater lean mass? The one with the greater total volume load. So the idea that you need greater volume to get stronger is not true. The idea that you need greater neuromuscular facilitation with the lesser of the velocity loss and then continually hit that could potentially have an effect. What?
Conjugated.
Yes. So we wanted to find out, and I skipped a paper here because we didn't do it in our lab. Another lab did it. But we wanted to see what contributed to kind of these differences. So this is one of the first papers we did when I got to TCU. Velocity drives the greater back squat observed. So what we did is we looked at trained and untrained because we wanted to see if it happened in both. As you can see, the trained, where's their 1RM? They had a 1.7 back squat to body mass ratio, so they were fairly strong. Whereas compared to the other ones, they were just over 1. Here was a cluster set configuration. Again, 10 repetitions, 2 minutes rest, repeated 4 times. We did something a little different this time. We did it what's called a true cluster. A true cluster, you're supposed to have 15 to 30 seconds rest in between sets. In between the set. So we did 5 reps, a quick 30-second rest, did the other 5 reps, then we did 90 seconds rest. So we equated the total amount of rest. What we found is something interesting. First, we see average force. Specifically, this is collapsed. For those of you who, we collapsed all the sets down to 10 repetitions. And you see greater force during the last few repetitions in the cluster set. But why did that happen? It was not because they actually had greater force. What we had to do is, as the repetitions became more difficult, if they were taking too long and they were about to fail, we had to strip. So what this is actually an example of is this group had greater total volume load, and that's why they were having greater force during the later repetitions, because we had to actually drop the load in the traditional set because they were hitting fatigue by sets 3 and 4. Does that make sense to everyone? This was velocity. As you can see, velocity decreases from set 1 to set 4. That is attenuated when you do the cluster. That's the black. That slope is less steep than that slope. And then if we look here, as you expect, velocity decreases in an almost linear fashion. But with the cluster sets, that brief rest allows velocity to come back up to where overall velocity is higher. The same pattern that you see in velocity, you observe in power, from set 1 all the way through set 4. Time under tension is obviously different because it's greater for the traditional versus the cluster. And the load, this is where you see the difference in load. So we actually they never had to drop weight here, and watch as the loads has to start dropping by repetition 5 in the traditional set. So that was what was driving the force. So we decided to say that velocity was contributing to the greater power. It's not force. This is a little different than a prior paper looking at the power clean that showed that force actually declines. Now, why would force decline in the power clean but not in the back squat? Why is it more complex? It has to do with the fact that it's more complex that the force declines. Has to do with the pull. The pull. Because a squat, the distance is always the same. You're always going back up to the same spot. But with the power clean, the less force you exert, the lower the pull's going to be. And so it's going to start dropping, and you're going to see evidence of that by them catching in a lower position. But you don't see it with traditional type lifts. So we also continued that study on a little bit more, and we wanted to look at what the acute response is. Because even though I say we're not concerned about hypertrophy, most people in the room, because you have muscles, are concerned about hypertrophy. Everybody wants to know, how am I going to get bigger? Am I still going to get bigger doing this thing? So we started to look at things, and at this time we weren't able to do biopsies in my laboratory, and we just got approved to do biopsies, so we may see some different things. But we wanted to look at some other things. So this is still part of that same study, untrained versus trained. This is kind of the experimental design of what happened and how we did it. We actually drew blood after set 1, set 2, set 3, set 4 at 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes. So we were drawing a lot of blood. They were cathetered, so it didn't require multiple sticks. Again, we see the average power, same thing as the last. But this is what we really thought was interesting. Total testosterone really was not different between the two groups. Neither was free testosterone. You kind of see a similar pattern. What was different was growth hormone. Growth hormone was different. Why would growth hormone be different? Well, here's your answer right here. Oops, it's actually on the next page, I think. Cortisol was a little different. You saw a little higher cortisol levels. But why do you think that growth hormone would be different? Potentially? Who's going to have greater lactate? Huh? Traditional. That could be driving some of that. Time under tension is obviously different. And so we're starting to kind of get to the idea of neuromuscular factors seem to be contributing to the greater strength and power. Hypertrophy seems to remain the same, but why is it remaining the same? Or is it actually the same? In the 12-week training study, we showed that it was. So then we want to look at myokines. So you can see we're kind of going on this pattern of looking at everything that we possibly can except for the actual muscle mass, the protein synthesis. And so we looked at specific myokines, myokine IL-6 and IL-15. IL-6 is associated with hypertrophy. IL-15 is also associated with hypertrophy. So again, you see the same pattern of what we're doing. Same traditional set versus cluster set configurations. This is just the mean force, mean velocity, and power. Again, we show the same thing. We're showing that power is greater, velocity is greater. Velocity is driving the greater power. Mean force is not different. We looked at IL-6 and we looked at IL-15. You really see no difference. You see what you expect to see with IL-6. You see it increase post. You see it increase 30 minutes and 60 minutes. Then you see it drop down. And you really don't see a difference here. It goes actually right back to baseline. IL-15, we see it increase post. We see it decrease somewhat at 30 minutes in the traditional, greater degree in the cluster. But then you see another peak at 24 and 48 hours in the traditional. IL-15, we don't exactly know the mechanism, but it's associated somewhat with oxidative metabolism. So the hypothesis, underlying hypothesis with those who have looked at IL-15 is that somehow oxidative metabolism is associated with IL-15, and one of the isoforms within IL-15 can potentially lead to hypertrophic gains of type 1 type fibers. So we've gone through force, velocity, power. We've kind of run the gamut of that. We went and looked at neuromuscular factors. What's next? We can't avoid the true question. So this is the true question. What actually happens with hypertrophy? So right now we have an ongoing study, and we just wrote up an abstract for ACSM. And this is looking at protein synthesis in the 5-hour period after cluster sets versus traditional sets. This is being done at University of Illinois in collaboration with our lab. This is the only study we've ever done where we look at men and women. All the other studies have just looked at women. The reason we've only looked at men is because it's very difficult to look at women to try and coordinate the cycles and get both conditions in. There is a study ongoing right now at George Mason University where they're redoing everything we've just done, but they're doing it all in women. Everything's being done in women. So, what do we see? Well, in the 5-hour period, there's no significant difference in between traditional and cluster, but you can kind of see that cluster looks a little bit lower. However, when we break it out to the 0 and 2 hour and the 2 and 5 hour, this is where you start to see somewhat of a difference. It's still not clear. It's not significant. But why would it be driving the hypertrophic muscle protein response but not anything else? What's truly different between the two? The time under tension, the velocity, the power. Which of those factors do you think is driving the protein synthesis? But traditional is the one that's having a greater one. So what's different in that that's not different in the other? Time under tension. We think it's the time under tension. So when it comes down to it, it's the time under tension. But from an athlete standpoint, which would you rather have? Would you rather have a big athlete who's slow or an athlete that's almost as big, that's much faster and much stronger? And this is my argument for why do we keep training like we train. But in those same lines, we're still looking at some more things, specifically in regards to velocity, because we believe that velocity drives a lot of the adaptations. So within this study, we're also looking at different molecular mechanisms that may be contributing to changes in the actual muscle itself. So one of the things that we were very interested in, specifically as it relates to cluster sets versus non-cluster sets, and by the way, I hate using the term cluster sets, because cluster sets suggest that you have to take that 30-second rest, and that is a specific type of alteration in configurations. But you can do 8 sets of 5 and not take the rest in the center, or you can do 4 sets of 6 versus 4 sets of 6 versus 4 sets of 2 by 3 versus 8 sets of 3. Did everybody understand what I just said? Sort of? Okay. All right, so we wanted to see if it actually affects the biomechanics of the movement, because as you fatigue, your movement mechanics should change. So there was a study done out of Kramer's lab probably about 2 years ago. The guy's name was Hooper. He's now down in Florida somewhere, I want to say. We had to reach out to him to find out how he ran some graphs because we couldn't figure out how to do graphs. I don't know. We're just not that smart at Texas Christian. But what he found is he put athletes through a fatiguing squat protocol. The squat protocol was a CrossFit protocol. So they had to do a set of 10, a set of 9, a set of 7, a set of 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What was interesting about that study when they looked at the biomechanics is that as the athletes got fatigued, do you think their biomechanics got better or worse? Better. Why do you think they would have got better?
Number of things. Mental concentration, training background.
What?
You have to be more efficient if you're fatigued.
No, they were self-preserving. They knew it was going to stink. They knew the workout was going to suck. They knew they had to do all these repetitions. So they shortened at the beginning. They weren't going all the way down. So they were cheating. They were sandbagging, and once they started getting fatigued, they couldn't sandbag any longer, and it just, they started going. So for all you CrossFitters in here, I'm sorry. So we wanted to look at when you were fatigued, but with true weightlifters. So we were comparing the alterations in movement mechanics between clusters and traditional. And so what we're looking at is we're dotting them up. I think there's 33 markers. We finished this study. We're writing it up right now. And we're looking to see if movement mechanics actually change. So again, you've got the same thing. The difference with this one is instead of doing 4 sets of 10, we're doing 4 sets of 6 at 80%, which is pretty intense. 4 sets of 6 at 80% is pretty heavy. Or 4 sets of 2 by 3. These are the markers. As you can see, they're markered all the way up everywhere. And we have a bilateral force plate, so we've got a force plate under each foot. Maintenance of torso. So this is the hip angle and the knee. You really don't see any difference in what's happening. There's no significant difference between the two as far as hip flexion or knee flexion. You can see that they're not quite hitting 90. They're hitting somewhere about 10 degrees short of 90, and that pretty much stays consistent. And we don't see anything different in the ankle. What we don't know is we're still looking at the joint power to see if how they produce the power is different, because even though the mechanics don't change, we're still seeing greater power with the cluster sets versus the non-cluster sets. And so we'll see kind of if that changes to see where they're generating their power, because it could have an effect on potential injury patterns. And again, these were fairly highly trained. I think their average back squat to body mass ratio was 1.9 plus or minus 0.2, so they're all above 1.5. The other thing we're looking at is how many of you are familiar with the Tendo and the GymAware units? Yes? No? So Tendo and GymAware units provide feedback. They give you velocity-based feedback. They're a linear positions transducer that you attach to the bar, and every time you lift, it tells you the speed at which that bar moves. It can also give you power, but it's calculating power based on velocity. If you use it, you can use it as a training tool with velocity-based training, but you're typically looking at a range. We wanted to see if just having that as a visual aid increased your velocity. So what we're looking at is having someone perform repetitions to fatigue at 75% and at 90% with and without the feedback, and the feedback being their peak velocity. Now, if their second repetition was higher than their first, then it automatically picks that second repetition. So whatever the peak velocity is in the set, we just have them going until they fatigue, but they're looking at their peak velocity trying to hit that target. Again, 75 and 90%. I don't think you put 90%. We're doing, again, the motion capture because we want to see if it alters their biomechanics having that feedback. What we do know is that the total amount of reps was not different with biofeedback versus no biofeedback. We did hypothesize that they'd actually do more if they had the feedback because they'd push themselves. That wasn't the case. Total volume load was not significantly different, even though it's a little higher. With biofeedback, you're looking at about 100 kilos. Velocity is higher with biofeedback all the way across. Again, this has nothing to do with clusters. This is just repetitions to fatigue. Peak velocity is a lot higher. That was their kind of target to use. And so that's kind of where we are with the greater velocity stuff. We're also looking at several other studies in terms of velocity right now within my lab. Most recently, we just got approved to look at the difference between velocity during the back squat across a variety of loads between power lifters and Olympic weightlifters. And we're correlating that with muscle cross-sectional area and muscle characteristics using ultrasound and pulling biopsies. And the rule, we're only looking at those who have qualified for a national level event. So we're only looking at national level competitors of powerlifters and weightlifters. And that's one of the theses going on right now within my lab. So that's kind of all my velocity stuff, but I thought I'd spend some time today answering some of your questions about what we've talked about here and your thoughts on velocity, and or just pick my brain about what it's like to do after you leave A&M. Because a lot of things, what you think we do is a lot different than what we actually do. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Yes, ma'am.
I have a few. For the George Mason study, are they doing it based on like women's cycles as well?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that that's kind of a new topic, more or less, but it's very hard to...
Well, one of our studies right now, it's an undergraduate research project. Nobody's ever looked at power production over the course of a woman's cycle. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at power production over a course of a woman's cycle. We know that changes exist of strength, but we don't know about velocity and power. So I have a student who she wants to look at kind of over at every phase of the cycle to see if power production is different.
Then I was also curious as to whether or not, like, you were also looking at like front squat or sumo squat or
We've not decided to look at other things now because we're pretty much kind of locked in with squat, and we've done. Squat is kind of consistent with most of the things that we do. Switching over to front squat, we'd expect to see the same, but I don't know. I would assume yes, but to go back and do all this, in terms of what's novel, I don't know that switching over to front squat would be any more novel than what we're doing now.
A lot of people aren't actually trained properly to do different types of squatting.
Yeah.
So there's more involvement there.
Like I know our baseball team, they only front squat. They don't back squat at all. And that's a theory from the strength coach, that he doesn't like them doing anything in that position. Whereas I know professional strength coaches who will throw them in that back squat position like that. Yeah.
But I was also curious, relating back to that, I know the NSCA, the chart that you love. Like, I love it too, you know, but only because, like, I don't know, me personally, like, I've learned that, like, I feel like rest periods are incredibly subjective based on, you know, I know it depends whether it's like strength, power, or hypertrophy or whatnot, but do you think that that's more of a subjective thing and it's not really like 2 full minutes to rest in between?
I think it's very subjective, and it's very dependent on exercise. It's dependent on how advanced the lifter is. You know, I have a football player in my class who squats over 500, and then I've got, you know, other recreational lifters who don't squat anywhere near that. Well, the way they train, they've trained their body, and this goes to kind of what I've been talking about. A bodybuilder is going to train their body. Yeah, they can work out at, you know, 80% and take 2 minutes rest and be fine. But to ask that football player to take 2 minutes rest after squatting at his 80%, there's no way. But also asking him to do 4 sets of 10 would be the stupidest thing. To me, it'd be like asking a sprinter to run a mile. And maybe that's not a fair assessment, but you're really asking them to go above and beyond what is required. If I can tell you this velocity and power can be improved, and if volume is what's the driving factor, then go back to the study that was just done where we look at, you know, a 20% versus a 40% decrease in velocity. Well, let's take it out and let's equate the total volume load, but make the 20% do the same volume load. Same hypertrophy, but better quality muscle.
And that's what I conjecture too, is that, like, the volume really mattered more and the time under tension than anything else. So it didn't really matter if you were doing like drop sets or pyramids or whatever.
Right.
Okay. It's just nice to do that reaffirmed.
First of all, putting 80% on the bar for an 4x6,
It's tough.
No, at my weights that would not happen.
Yeah.
But
I couldn't do it either.
Similar with a higher intensity, so closer to the 90% range, above really more like maybe 88% range.
Well, that's where that's where we train. It's just doing it is tough, because then you can go, and a friend of mine, Greg and James Tufano, did a study where they compared 4 sets of 12 or 3 sets of 12 at 60 or 65%. Then they bumped it up to clusters, and we're doing 4 sets of something by something at 75%, and then another one which was at a higher intensity. And what they were looking at is just trying to maintain the same loss in velocity at higher intensities. But again, my argument is that if whatever intensity you choose, whether it's 90% or whatever, it's the loss in velocity that you're looking at.
Exactly.
So having somebody do singles at 90 is better than having them do 2 or 3, because you're going to see that the quality of repetition is going down.
Well, I would say I'm a competitive power lifter with pretty high numbers, trying to qualify for nationals. But I will say, like, when I step on the platform, like, there is a reduction in the velocity, of course, when you actually compete versus when you actually train. At least that's what my method is. That's what I've learned from a lot of mentors and stuff. So I just found the difference in some of those other situations, you know, also in a football on the line, you know, when you have linemen that push against each other, it's basically they're trying to just beat force against force.
Yeah.
And that can even be slow. So I'm just kind of like even curious just to see actually more maybe towards those
higher intensities.
What that would be like, how the power versus maybe grinding it out
right.
would play a difference between.
Well, then it goes, if you read Prue probably 5 years ago, wrote 2 papers. They're both in sports med. It's factors affecting power or something like that. It's part 1 and part 2. Actual versus intended movement velocity.
Yeah.
So how fast you move it versus how fast you intend to move it doesn't matter.
Really?
Yeah. So if you think you're moving fast, think you're moving it fast, your body doesn't know the difference. It just thinks it's moving it fast, whether or not you're actually moving it fast or not. So you have the intended versus actual. Now, if I tell an athlete, you or anybody, move this as fast as possible, whether it's moved fast, meaning numbers-wise, if they're trying to move fast, they're going to get faster.
Factors of like the
Yes.
gradient there. Okay, so I'm on the lower end of that spectrum. I can push and push. I'll do all types of bands, chains, whatever. Pause. That bar, my 50 looks like my 90.
Oh,
That's
so
just me.
that's just your speed.
But I can think faster, and I'll feel like I'm going faster. So that's really interesting that you say that.
Yeah,
That's
look
still
at her stuff, and I don't know if anything's been written on it since then, but it's actual versus intended movement velocity is a section within that sports med article. Or if you send me an email, it's one of the prophets that I make them read in our Bible of muscle phys. Yes, sir.
I'm curious your thoughts on this. So you talked about a heavier, slower player versus maybe a more powerful, lighter player, but let's put that in the context of like a running back. So someone's taking a lot of contact that's probably going to need to be heavier just to protect themselves. What would your training focus on with them? Because they're probably going to be carrying around weight more than their natural weight, just so that they can take more contact.
Yeah, but they still need to be powerful. And if they need to be, if it's total volume load, what I'm saying is if you keep the total volume load, which is what we're seeing, total volume load the same, and just watch that velocity, then I can put the same amount of muscle on. It's just going to be better quality, faster muscle.
And you need to consider strength to match ratio.
Yeah.
Just because you're bigger, stronger doesn't mean you're faster. And the element is, if you train properly, you're going to reduce injuries just by doing that.
There was a study out of OU a few years back, and I don't remember who did it. It was after Chad left, I think, and they had followed their program for like 4 years, and they basically said that if you're going to recruit anybody, recruit somebody who's powerful because you can't increase power. And my thing was, you just told me that your strength conditioning coaches were crap. Because if you're putting that out, then you're basically saying that you can't increase somebody's power, and that's not true. Yeah, genetically people are more prone to have greater power output, but you can train somebody to increase their power. I mean, it can be done.
Yeah, you know what you're doing.
Yeah. The other thing that we found very interesting that nobody's ever looked at, and we did a pilot study on it last year, how many of you are caffeine users? Nobody's ever looked at caffeine's effect on velocity just for resistance training. Everybody only looks at it from a sprint or an aerobic performance aspect. Well, what we find is that if you give caffeine in terms of training, now the argument in sprint events is that at the time that you actually take it for the event, your adrenaline's already so high it's going to overwhelm any caffeine response you could potentially have anyway. But if you use it in your resistance training, what we found is you actually do produce higher velocities when you use caffeine. And so if you're training with higher velocities, then it's going to then transfer better to a sport application. We've been wanting to carry that out, but Andy Fry up at Kansas has done some stuff with one of those MPSs, multi-ingredients performance supplements, where you just basically take a salt shaker and throw everything in there. And they've done some stuff that had caffeine in it. But we found, I think it was somewhere around 3 milligrams per kilogram, gave you enough benefit to increase velocity just over a set of 5. We did 5 sets of 5 at 75%, I believe.
Now, would you do that with actual coffee or like pill form?
You could get that with coffee.
You can even take caffeine from tablets.
Yeah, it's not a high dose of caffeine at 3 milligrams per kilogram. I think it's somewhere around 200 milligrams, which is about what's in a cup of coffee. I don't know, I don't drink coffee, it's nasty.
Like 3 cups of coffee-ish.
Oh, really? Well, yeah, based on body weight, yeah. Yes, sir.
So you were talking about the sets of like 4 by 2 by, what did you call it? 4 by 2?
4 by 2 by 3.
Okay, versus like 8 by.
So the 4 by 6, how you write a cluster is 4 by 2 by 3. So your cluster rest is 30 seconds and this rest is whatever it is. But I can transfer this because this is 24 reps, this is 24 reps. I could go 8 by 3 and just keep this rest consistent.
Right, so that would just be like the same total rest as the other
Yeah.
2 sets. And have y'all seen like if there are any differences between like 4 by 2 by 3 versus 8?
No, we haven't. We actually talked about that the other day in our lab group, is just to compare. You would think there was, because metabolism is going to drive anything. You're going to, phosphocreatine is not going to be depleted in either one of these. So maybe it wouldn't, maybe it would. But I think this may actually attenuate velocity to a greater degree. That's why I've kind of moved away from talking about cluster sets, and I'm more just manipulating the set to rest ratio. Because to me, even this at 80, 80, and 80, that's too much. When I prescribe 80, I'd probably do something like 6 by 3. Right. That's more doable to me than an 8 by 3.
The reason why I ask is because that, the whole like 8, we usually do, like in my training, the program that I get for Olympic style weightlifting is always like 5 by 3, 6 by 3. And it's like, we don't have set rest ranges. It's basically like when you feel like you're 100%, and you go hit the next set.
Right.
And we have like apps on our, so I'll like post my phone up, and then I'll record my set, and my coach can put like a cap on my bar just on the app, and he can track the velocity. Mm-hmm. And so he can say, like, I'll send it while I'm at the gym, and I'll send him a video, and it'll be like, hey, your bar speed on the 3rd rep was slower, you need to take more rest. And then I'll track the next set, and it'll say, okay, that was a lot better. How long did you rest for that one? And then he can track like things like that.
Yeah.
Like he's in Houston, and I'm in College Station, and we'll get like stuff like that. We track bar speed, and the same thing we've done with caffeine, like, how much caffeine did you have today? When did you drink it? Things like that. And we're tracking all these different variables. We've done like, I've told him like, I haven't taken caffeine today. And he's like, Lloyd, this is your bar speed today. And so it's just, I think it's really interesting to see that.
Yeah, I'd recommend buying a GymAware, or I know we have a Tendo over in our lab, in Kreider's lab.
We've got a couple now.
Yeah. But just borrow one. So I borrowed a lot of things while I was in grad school that you use for training.
Borrow means you return them though.
Yeah. I only buy things now that I use to train with, so. But yeah, to me, I've done a lot of stuff with concussions now, but this stuff is really fun to me, and getting to look at the molecular, I always say train how you want the muscle to act. And do we want the muscle to decrease in velocity over decreasing velocity over decreasing velocity? And to me, the answer is always no. So.
We've got about 5 minutes left if there's any more questions, comments.
My email, easy to find, it's jonathan.oliver@tcu. Just let me know if you have questions.
Thanks for taking the trip down.